deep, 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 in the back of your mind, how deep are your dreams?
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, and welcome to the DC offices of Google. I am your host for this afternoon, Michelle Jawando, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as our head of progressive engagement and strategic partnerships. I am also going to bring into this room my sister, Malika, who is head of social impact at YouTube. And together, working with amazing partners like the Marshall Project and the Undefeated, we are moving forward to do what we recognize is a life's mission and a calling and is connected to the values of this company. How do we create a world that's more equitable, that's more inclusive, and that is more visible for all people? And while that sounds like a really huge, gargantuan task, we make progress in very small ways. And sometimes that's hosting a panel of amazing leaders. Sometimes that's working on our own algorithms so we aren't lifting up bail, or we're lifting up work around bail and probation. Sometimes that means us investing in local communities. And oftentimes that means bringing conversations and convenings together to be focused, to use the power of who Google is, whether it's on our philanthropic side, whether it's our policy, whether it's working with our partners across the globe, to make this world more equitable and more fair for everyone. And so I am honored and privileged to welcome you to this conversation today. I am excited to participate and to learn and to listen. And I am, again, so thankful for the leadership of the Marshall Project. I remember as a civil rights lawyer when the Marshall Project started, and everybody was like, oh, this is great. I see my friends in the audience, and we were like, oh, yes, now someone's actually keeping track of this work all across the US, and it has meant so much for so many people to bring voice, to make things visible, and Google is happy to just play a small part. So thank you for your leadership, and let's get started with today. Thank you.
I could just ask the panelists to come on up, be relatively informal here. So I'm Carroll Bogert, I'm the president of the Marshall Project. You might be able to guess which one is Maya Moore, arguably the best women's basketball player in history, two-time Olympic gold medalist, four-time WNBA champion, et cetera. The stats are amazing. Michael Rubin, co-owner of the 76ers and co-founder of Reform Alliance, and Clinton Yates, who's columnist for the Undefeated, a commentator for WTOP and for ESPN. So a very distinguished panel, and very excited to be here with all of you. I wanted to talk a little bit first about the personal motivations that a couple of you really bring to this issue. And I just want to tell you that in my previous job, I worked for Human Rights Watch, a global human rights organization. And I worked there because I met a woman whose daughter had been kidnapped in Uganda. She had been dragged into the Lord's Resistance Army, a rebel army in Uganda, and forced to serve. And the mother became an activist because she wanted to get her daughter out of the clutches of this terrible rebel group. And the mother was such an effective advocate that at one point, this rebel group came to her and said, "We'll give you back your daughter if you shut up." And she said no. And that moment of departing from the personal motivation and her deep well of love for her daughter and transferring her allegiance and her activism to the bigger cause was, as you can imagine, an incredibly personally difficult moment. But this is what happens sometimes when someone takes on a mission. They come to it from their own experience, and they make a leap to the broader issue. And I want to ask Maya a little bit about how you came to make the leap from the concern for a friend who's in prison to the bigger issue of criminal justice reform.
That's a powerful story. The more you engage in this space, the more stories that you hear, which, like you said, makes you think about the reasons people get involved in reform or these issues. And the fact that a lot of it happens organically, I'm actually not too mad at. I think as I've gone deeper and deeper into this journey, I've realized if it's not personal to you in some level, you're probably not going to engage in it. And so part of what I've learned as I've gotten to, I try to steward my platform really well. And when I say things and when I lead people in certain directions, I want to be very thoughtful about it. And so I've been learning. Jonathan Irons is the man that inspired me. It's a wrongful conviction that my family's been connected with through a prison ministry program over about 20 years ago. And through getting to know Jonathan and his story, the whole world of criminal justice reform and mass incarceration and racial inequality just became so real to me. And part of what I want to do when I tell people about Jonathan's story or the issues is not just look at this story, but look at the stories in your community and in your neighborhood. And so that's how I think people can move in the broader cause, is when they actually realize the broader cause is right there. It's really not that far away. And so I think that's been helpful for me in encouraging people to, learn about Jonathan's story, but also understand there are stories way closer to you than you probably feel comfortable talking about. And that way, I think you'll be able to get some roots in people being invested in real change.
Michael, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your friendship with Meek and how that drew you into this cause.
Yeah, for me, I was fully focused on work and my family, my friends, and I guess fortunately or unfortunately, the system got one of my friends for no reason. I think it's become widely known at this point, but Meek Mill, the rapper, had become a really good friend of mine over several years, and I'd always heard these crazy situations and stories about he had this crazy judge and he kept getting sent to prison for not committing a crime, and it all sounds crazy, but you don't. To your point, you don't really understand it until you see it firsthand. And then Meek got brought into by a judge into a court for a probation violation, and he said to me, "Hey, can you come with me? I want you to see this firsthand." And that experience, really changed my life. I went with him, and I watched a probation officer get up and say how great he was doing and recommend no sentence. I watched a district attorney get up and recommend no sentence. And then I watched a judge send him to jail for 2 to 4 years for not committing a crime. And I'd never, grown up as not from Black America or not from, in a relatively middle-class world, I didn't think shit like that happened. And I was, I'd say I was shook at my core. And I looked at him, the day it happened, and said, I'm not going to stop till I get you out of prison. Again, it was one of my good friends. I couldn't have done anything. I would have been a horrible person if I didn't do that. And I was fortunate to sit next to Jay-Z's partner, who I'd never met before, and she said, I'm not stopping. And the two of us joined forces and were unrelenting until we got him out of prison. What changed for us was a couple months into this, it came out that all of the cops that originally arrested him were dirty. They were stealing people's money. Many of them had been arrested. Meek was charged, but probably a lot of people know this by now, but he was charged for pointing a gun at multiple police officers when he was 18 years old. Meek always told me from the day I met him, I don't know, 6 years ago, if a black kid points a gun at multiple police officers, that's called suicide. You don't get to do that and get away with it. And once it was proven, the cops came forward and said, no, he never pointed the gun, the whole thing's a lie, and we still couldn't get him out of prison. That's when our whole emphasis shifted from how do we get you out of prison to, as soon as we get you out of prison, how do we take on the overall system? And that's when we started the Reform Alliance.
Right, right. Clinton, maybe you can talk a little bit about sort of sports figures being involved in politics. There is something of a tradition of sports remaining apolitical. Jesse Owen and Jackie Robinson notwithstanding, of course, it's not a blanket case. But are we seeing a more political era for sports? And if so, why is that?
I mean, I think it's political in the more generalized context of what are, human politics in a way that I think is probably much, I don't want to say more important, but in terms of what people actually will pay attention to than, I don't know, Bill Bradley being in Congress or whatever it may be. And that to me is the most powerful place that a lot of athletes can impact and exist in spaces. It's not about necessarily go vote for this and X, Y, and Z down ballot. It's about like, hey, you can talk about this in the space that you need to in order to feel decent about yourself, And I think all the time about, people ask you like why you play sports and all this other stuff, and it's like, dude, it's the bus rides, it's the eating meals together, it's not the hitting buckets, you know what I mean? And it's like, and that's where athletes can get to other people who pay attention to sports. It's when Timmy, who lives in Iowa City, sees 4 guys get up in front of the ESPYs, and I've said this before in spaces, in front of the ESPYs and talk about police brutality. When his racist uncle comes to the breakfast table the next day, he can tell that dude, we don't do that. We don't talk like that here. It's you know what I mean? It's not necessarily about him being directly related in whatever. It's just about getting the message out because people listen to athletes. That's just the most basic thing there is about it. And if you talk about being a good steward, if you're stewarding things in ways that are responsible, people are going to listen to you. And it's not just about what happens when you're on the court being the athlete communicating or when they're in the space looking at you. It's just about what they think about all the time. If somebody's going to know what your shoes are every day of the week, they should probably have an idea of what you think about, I don't know, healthcare. And, just naturally that's going to trickle into how they communicate with the rest of their world.
Well, I think it's interesting the term you use, athlete communicator. Of course, Maya, you talked about platform. Part of this is also that athletes now have social media platforms. They're not, as it were, mediated, with all due respect to people like us who are in the media.
I get it.
There's an unmediated voice of the athlete to the public. And of course, there's also the Black Lives Matter movement, which I think has awakened a lot of the country to this and sort of stimulated a lot more dialogue and conversation around criminal justice than we've ever had before. Are those contributing elements, you think, to a different politics around sports?
There's a direct line between not paying college athletes, Black Lives Matter, and where we are now, which is the concept. I'm not going to get super far into this, but like the concept of the value of the black body is like a whole sort of thing that if you really want to go down that road, you can do plenty of work. But basically what it came down to, as far as I'm concerned, is black athletes being the most visibly empowered bodies that we have in more ways than just their minds or, what they sort of physically look like. It's what they can actually do is different than what anybody else can actually do. And so there's value in that. And being able to realize that and take that back and express yourself as somebody who can do that when so many black Americans just don't. The value of your body is a $sign in a guy's account who owns a prison, as opposed to the number you see on SportsCenter that a human is getting to play basketball or whatever, And so I think there's a direct line between all of those things, absolutely, and why it's extra important these days when athletes have so much power to do so.
Powerfully said. Thank you. Maya, do you want to talk a little bit about, Win with Justice and also about why you've chosen to focus on prosecutors in the system? I think it's a little, Michael, you're really more on kind of probation and parole, and I want to ask each of you how you chose that focus.
Absolutely. So, like I mentioned, I got to know Jonathan through my family in Missouri, where I was born. He's in the Jefferson City Correctional Center, and like I said, has been there for going on his 23rd year of being wrongfully convicted. And so I met Jonathan when I was 18. Just turned 30 in June, whoop whoop. And so if you do the math, that's 12 years. So it's been over a decade since I have been, since my life has been changed and shaken in a way that I had no idea it was going to be changed. And so I am pretty much just, month by month, year by year, developing a friendship with Jonathan, keeping up with his case. My godparents are literally doing investigative work for him. Different nonprofits are coming in and out of his story, some more helpful than others. But the bottom line is, if you don't have money, you're really not going to have a lot of progress. And so right around 2016, some of my teammates and I decided to speak out. We wore black T-shirts that says "Change starts with us: justice and accountability." We were just devastated over the police brutality. Some police were killed in Texas, and we just wanted to honor those lives that were lost and just say, hey, we need more accountability in our leadership, and everybody needs to be better. It was just one of those moments in sports where we're like, we're people right now, and we're going to remind everybody that we are people first and athletes second. And I think I got some courage from that. I got some momentum, I got some boldness, and I reached out to the team of people that help and support me, and Win with Justice was a nonprofit that was created because I realized, I have a story like this. I'm involved in this story. And Win with Justice is about changing what it means to get a win in our justice system. As I started learning more and more, I knew Jonathan's situation, but I started getting more education of how our justice system works, the history of it, how it's set up. And I learned that prosecutors are literally the most powerful actors in our justice system because they basically set the rules of the game. And so if a 16-year-old is being charged over sentence, that's the prosecutor. If whatever the charge is, the amount of time, all of that is set by the prosecutor. And so prosecutorial misconduct, I learned that word, say that 5 times fast. Prosecutorial misconduct is a huge, huge reason, even more powerful than the judges, of why injustice happens in our justice system. And so Win with Justice is redefining what a win is in our justice system. It's not just about getting convictions, not just on the prosecutorial belt, but are we actually getting justice in our communities by everyone involved, but especially the prosecutors. And another thing I learned, I'm just learning so much, grinding all my life, playing games, winning gold medals, championships. I feel like my learning what it means to be a citizen was neglected, and so I'm learning a lot of these things. And I learned, we vote for our prosecutors. Who knew? We can do something about this. And so I just felt like it was in an empowering lane for me to help educate, because people can actually get involved in their local elections and see what the prosecutors' values are. If the things that they're saying are actually real changes, or are they just saying something to sound like they're checking a box? And so I think Win with Justice is a huge opportunity to connect my legacy as an athlete to education, because a lot of this, the documentaries that you've been a part of, like education and helping people understand this is how it works. We know it's not working, but this is how it works, and this is where we can go to possibly get some solutions. And so I'm just excited to continue to build Win with Justice, and Win with Justice also highlights Jonathan's story, just to let people understand this is a real life person, and there's more Jonathans out there. And so you can really start to understand the weight of why we should care when you see someone's story connected with, educating them on what we can do about it.
I think in Philadelphia, Michael, you have a new prosecutor, actually, who is Larry Krasner, the DA, is bringing some change. Your Reform Alliance is really focused on probation and parole, as I understand it. Is that
Yeah,
right?
so we didn't find probation, it found us, if I'm being completely blunt. You know, for me, having zero experience to the criminal justice system before kind of living in it with Meek, most people probably don't know this. There's two things I think most people probably don't know. One, you can go to prison without committing a crime. Had no idea of that, and it happens every day. Matter of fact, there's 750,000 people that go to prison a year. A quarter of them go for technical violations. That means they didn't commit a crime. The three biggest technical violations are tested positive for marijuana, becoming legal in most states. I didn't pay my fines. A lot of people can't afford to pay them. Or I missed the appointment with my probation officer, which could be I have a job, I don't want to lose my job, so I'm either going to lose my job or I'm going to miss my appointment. So for me, Meek had been on probation his entire adult life. Since 19 years old, he'd been on probation, and as of 2 weeks ago, he had 6 years left. So I always joke with Meek, he had the Guinness Book of World Records longest probation, but it's actually not. In Pennsylvania, there's no cap on probation. You can be on probation forever. So someone like Meek can never commit a new crime, and he got sent back to prison 4 different times for technical probation violations. So I think knowing, you know, as soon as I realized that the system was fundamentally broken, it wasn't about Meek's case, that's when I started to understand the math. And the math tells you something really simple. There's 6.7 million people in the system today. 4.5 million are on probation and parole. And probation and parole is the biggest part of the system that nobody was really focused on. So knowing that Meek has had his entire adult life stalked by probation, we said, we need to change the really the probation and parole system. That's 100% of what the Reform Alliance is focused on. We're doing two things. It's really straightforward. One, we're educating people. And you know, to me, awareness is everything. I know I didn't understand any of this till I learned it firsthand. We were talking about that earlier before, you know, we spent time with all of you. So I think education is really important. You know, I think, you know, you have fairly unknown partners like Jay-Z and Meek Mill that helps to bring a lot of awareness to what we're doing. So they've brought a ton of awareness. Number one. And number two, we're changing laws on a state-by-state basis, and we're starting in Pennsylvania. That's the first state we're focused on. And we want to change the laws to be logical, that you can't be sent to prison for a technical probation violation, that there's caps on how long you can be on probation for. So if you're not committing new crimes, that the system's not going to ruin your life. We want it to be fair and equitable. We'll keep the communities safe. And this will be a big test for us. We started this in January. We raised over $50 million to start it with. We've got, I think, some of the most powerful partners. And by the way, we raised it all self-funded. It was all from, you know, Jay-Z, Meek, myself, Robert Kraft, Dan Loeb, Robert Smith, Mike Novogratz, Clara Sy, and Laura Arnold. So everyone, we've put in over $50 million to this. We hired Van Jones as the CEO, brought on an incredible team, including Jessica, that's sitting in the front row with us today, who's been fighting criminal justice reform for most of her adult life. And we got to see, we got to change the laws state by state, and we're fighting in Pennsylvania right now. We'd like to, by November, get our bills passed, which would probably affect more than 100,000 people in Pennsylvania directly, and probably millions of people when you look at the families and friends of them. So we are very focused.
So that's at the state level, really, more than at the city level in Philadelphia? Is there any change in
everything's
Philadelphia?
really at the state level. The laws are on a state-by-state basis. And what's like incredible to think about, New York, which is where I spend one day less than half of my time. So I spend a little bit less than half of my time in New York. And
I think we know why.
yeah, otherwise I'd be working for the state of New York. So, you know, in New York, probation and parole, it's relatively logical. There's things to do to make it better, but it's relatively logical. They have about one in about 125 or 150 people. 1 in 125 or 150 people on probation or parole. In Pennsylvania, where I live, it's 1 in 37. In Georgia, 1 in 35. In Georgia, it's 1 in 17. So think about this. Georgia has 700,000 people on probation and parole. It's like you can't, everyone's on probation in the state.
That's my state.
Well, how many people do you know on probation in Georgia?
I'm learning.
Yeah, it's so. By the way, I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine who lives in Georgia. I'm like, "Are you on probation?" He's like, "Why do you think I'm on probation?" He actually looked at me. He said, "Why do you think I'm on probation?" I'm like, "Because everyone in Georgia's on probation." So we're going in the states that are the most screwed up, and we're taking those states on, and we're building alliances, Republican, Democrats together to change the laws. Pennsylvania's where we're starting first, and then we're going to, if you just look at the map of the most screwed up states, that's where we're going next.
Wow. Interesting. Clinton, I think a lot of where sports journalism intersects with the criminal justice system, it's also where athletes get in trouble with the law for one reason or another. Is that, how do you think the field of sports journalism, which I know you can't speak for entirely, kind of has dealt with those?
I'll speak for the field of sports journalism
Okay, go
entirely.
ahead.
As somebody who has worked in other journalism as well. I mean, I wrote locally here in D.C. about stuff. So, I mean, to me, athletes getting in trouble is very much. I'm trying to think of how to say this without sounding crass. It's the point of intersection that is sort of the like disaster porn kind of view of it. You know what I'm saying? It's when you think about mugshots of athletes and all that. I don't know how sort of productive that portion is in terms of because athletes also very often, just because of the rhythms of their life, don't exist in the same spaces that I think a lot of humans do in terms of just general safety. I mean, you talk about probation numbers. I mean, somebody's always like with you typically or watching you when you're on a team, and that's sort of the part of it that makes it fun, as I was alluding to earlier. But I think when athletes get humanized by crimes, it really hits hard to a lot of people who just don't have any recourse at all. And that's why it's so tough, because I don't know, I think about all the people who literally were in the same situation as, I don't know, insert said football player on a team, and there's just no way. They just don't have a chance. And it's, from an education standpoint, like you talked about, I think that's what athletes can do the most, is just like show like, yo, this is, even if this is not my life, this is real life. And it's very difficult for a lot of fans to accept that. Well, what do you care? You make $80 million. Like, what do you know about it? It's like, well, my cousin doesn't make $80 million, or my barber doesn't make $80 million. Like, these people live in America. And that's why it's dangerous to just think about just athletes in terms of their run-ins with the law, because it is such a different experience from the average Negro in America.
Right.
But what they are doing is bringing so much awareness. And I see, I look, when we went through with Meek, the amount of people that stepped up for him, he'd still be in prison today if it wasn't for so many athletes that were just front and center
right.
in promoting and saying, here's a guy who literally got sent to prison for 2 to 4 years for popping a wheelie on a motorcycle, and it's ridiculous. And by the way, James Harden went to prison to see him, who doesn't play for us. And LeBron, he was putting a bunch of stuff on social media for him. And our guys, Ben Simmons, Joel Embiid. By the way, taking Joel Embiid to the prison was the funniest thing I've ever done in my life. I've never seen a 7'2" person more scared in their life than walking in prison where there was actually nobody but him and Meek. But he was, it was a...
I mean, dude, think about that, though. Like, that's the physical...
By the way...
Like, the physical...
The cages.
On your brain, right? The cages. That's a thing.
100%. It was fascinating because I'd already been to see Meek 10 times, so I guess become a, I don't want to say immune, but I just become used to just this situation. But I'll tell you, when I see what's happening in the NBA and the NFL today, and you've got players that have such big social media followings, and they can make such a difference. And you talked to, it's what you look at your platform and what you can do to go out there and tell a story. It's amazing how much that can make a difference. And what I'm thrilled with is to see so many athletes picking causes that they care about and using their social media to really promote it. And it's making the country and the world a better place. Yep. And I think certainly, basketball is, my number one sport. And, I see our guys doing it all the time. And it's, I think it's the reason Meek's on the other side of it today, and I think it's, and I see them get behind all kinds of causes. And now I watch Meek, and I see so much of his social media is about cases that have nothing to do with reform, but there's people he met who he knows have been wrongfully accused, like you talked about, where he's like, I've got to stand up and make a difference. So.
Yeah. No, I think there are many ways in which the media can be used for good. I guess I'm just asking about, as professional journalists, people come, I don't know why they're coming to the Undefeated, maybe they're coming to read about sports. Is there a limit to how much they want to be preached at about criminal justice issues, which isn't, what they're there, it wasn't what they felt like they were clicking on?
There's a limit in the context of if you're not a good storyteller, people aren't going to want to read your stories. And I don't mean that, adversely to anybody. It's just that there's a way and a reason to indicate why something matters to somebody. That is the skill. I think of, and if it intersects with sports in a way that they can understand, well then, yeah, you've done the job. But I do think there is something to be said for how difficult that is, because, look, as much as sports is not real in the sense that, like, the jobs people do are different than working in a factory or whatever, it is very real in terms of impact. And so some people, I don't know, it is very hard for some people to not separate the concept of a win and a loss on the field to who the humans are who are doing it. And that is a very difficult bridge to gap. But I think that's also why when you see situations like what Maya's talking about, where, the people playing are actually the ones talking about this in any way at all, then you have to say something. It would be irresponsible as a journalist at that point to not address what is being addressed by the very people that we are there to see. And so that's been where the biggest change has gotten better from what I would consider my side as a professional. Well, if athletes are talking about it, well, then you have no choice. And it's easier to bridge that gap from a work standpoint than it was before, when it was sort of like, let me link these 9 things so you can understand why this, matters at all.
Right. Maya, I think obviously you're one of the most celebrated and famous women's basketball players of all time, but it is obviously the case that women's sports, as we know, receive less patronage and attention in this country than men's sports. How do you deal with the kind of unique, pressures and challenges of being a woman athlete in this space?
Well, that's a real challenge. There's so many different stories within stories of our country and our culture, and women in sports is a newer thing. It's a newer phenomenon. We're still on the kind of the women in sport experiment in our life here in America, and I think some things have been done well, some things haven't been done as well. But I think we are, regardless of where a women in sport journey is, there's a bigger story that whether my platform is Joel Embiid's or, one of the best NFL players, regardless of your platform, I think the bigger story is regardless of your platform, you can still do something. Mm-hmm. And I've been blessed to have a bigger platform than I could have ever dreamed as an 8-year-old girl when the WNBA was launched. But I think my platform has been grown because of where we are right now in this conversation, too. The more you connect with people beyond your sport, I think, whether you're a man or a woman, it kind of goes away. You just become more connected to your community. And that's really more of what I've discovered. Like Clinton was talking about, when you are a high-profile athlete, there's a sense of your humanity that's kind of stripped and altered, for better, I don't think it's for better, but there's some of the sacrifices you make, and when you become a public figure and you become this kind of superhero fake thing to fans. And it's a hard thing to navigate. It's so easy to get wrapped up in, this isn't a real person. This is my, person I'm playing NBA 2K with. So what I've tried to do is fight for my humanity by connecting with humanity in a way that's hard, and it's difficult, and it takes time, and I'm not comfortable going into a prison knowing most of those black men are fans of mine. Like it's just one of the stats. A third of WNBA fans are black males between the age of 18 and 35. A little bit of our target market info, but
I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, like everywhere I go, black men. It's great. They're like, yo, respect. Can I play you one-on-one? It's that.
I got you on that.
I'm
definitely taking you in that game.
Every time it's, yo, mad respect. You want to play me one-on-one? I'm like, thank you. No. But those black men are the same people that I'm now advocating for, and it's just, my mind's blown. I didn't do that on purpose. It's just kind of how God has me in this place of, this is bigger than sports. This is getting connected with my community and being uncomfortable to enter into someone else's world because I have a privilege, and entering into that world. So I have a unique platform, I think, even as a women's basketball player, because of the audience that I can reach, that means that much more, and people will have that much more respect or pay that much more attention to. And then I can also role model, because, I think you'll see more respect from the men for the women's game from the pros than you actually do the general population. You'll have, LeBron has a more accurate respect for what I do than Joe at, the sports bar. And so when you see that I can be helpful to role model what it looks like to educate yourself, because a lot of athletes can be nervous because they don't know either, just like I didn't know. And so the education of the athletes, from athlete to athlete, I think is another level of, it's okay to look weak for a moment and to say, I didn't know, or I don't know as much as I should, and I want to learn. I think that can also empower people to say, me too, I didn't know, and now I want to learn. So I've tried to do that with my story and saying, just like I said to you guys earlier, I didn't know some of these things, but now I'm learning, and we can all learn, and we can be leaders in telling these issues by, again, just the education of sharing your educational journey with, Joelle saying, I went into a prison, these are real stories that people are going to want to hear about. So I think there's so much potential there,
Right.
Whether you're a man or a female, to educate and tell some of these stories.
And maybe educate fellow owners. Michael, what is the community of team owners? How have they reacted to your activism? And do you feel like you're able to bring others along? Do they want to get involved? Do they want to stay out? What's your reading of that community?
I think the best advocates for changing the country or the world have been the athletes themselves. I think they've got big platforms and they're not risk averse. When Ben Simmons or Joel Embiid or you or LeBron James decides that there's something they believe in, they go for it, and I think it's amazing. I never thought about Meek's situation from a Sixers perspective. I thought about it. This is one of my closest friends who's being completely screwed, and I would be a horrible human being if I didn't step up for him because nobody else is going to be able to fix this. And so
You just happen to be a sports owner who's a friend.
it was just complete coincidence. I think, if I'm pretty blunt, generally in sports, the NBA is by far and away, I'd say, the most forward thinking from a league perspective, in that they're less nervous to take on a issue that they really believe in, where in general in sports throughout the world, they like to stay out of these issues. I think the two people that were front and center were myself and Robert Kraft, who's a really good friend of mine, who I kind of drug into the Meek situation. Robert, I think in the beginning, he knew Meek through me, but he wasn't really friendly with him. But Meek would call me from prison. I'd always put Robert on the phone to try to give Meek some inspiration. And then, it was a really fascinating story. It was probably one of the best breaks in the case. I was in Turks and Caicos with my girlfriend, Robert, and his girlfriend, and Meek called, and I put him on the phone with Robert. I said, hey, why don't we go see him when we land in Philadelphia? And he said, I want to go see him. And Robert went to prison to see him. And he goes in there, and Meek had a smile from ear to ear. And Robert said to Meek, I don't get this. You've been in prison for 5 months. You didn't commit a crime, and you're smiling. And Meek looked at him, and he said, Robert, I've been sent to prison. Actually said, Rob, because he calls him Rob, not Robert. He says, Rob, I've been in prison I've been sent to prison 4 different times for never committing a crime, and no one ever cared before. Now I've got Michael, Jay, you, and everyone fighting for me, and how could I not be happy? And we left there that day, and we got in the car, and Robert literally called me 10 times that night saying, how have you not got him out of prison so far? It went from why are you spending so much time on this, to how have you failed at getting him out of prison so far? By the way, Robert went out and spoke, and a week later, Meek got released. And Robert, there was nothing that was bigger than, Robert Kraft, a 78-year-old, billionaire of the most successful sports team in modern sports history, is saying, this is screwed up. that brought so much awareness. There was no bigger story than Robert spoke on Meek. And so, I think in general, owners are very nervous to take on hairy issues, and I get it. We had fans that were calling and saying, hey, we're going to give up our season's tickets. And we had people calling Fanatics and saying, which is my primary income, and saying, I don't want to buy from Fanatics anymore. My attitude was kind of like, screw them, I don't care. So, but that's not a normal approach.
I think you probably just cleaned up your...
Yeah, I did. I really said fuck them, look, for me, it was so close to home. I had no choice. I think there is a lesson to be learned that I think if there's something that an owner really believes in, I think they should go after it. And hopefully watching, when we started with Meek's situation, everybody told me I was nuts. Other than Adam Silver and my partner Josh Harris. Everyone told me I was nuts. Like I should not get involved with this. It turned to everyone realized what an injustice it was, and now we've educated hundreds of millions of people, and we've done something really significant, starting the Reform Alliance and raising more than $50 million and hiring an incredible team, and have a stated goal to get 1 million people out of the system by 2023 that I believe we're going to do. So I believe that people will learn from this, but it's got to be authentic too. Like I would have, had this not happened to Meek, if Meek would have said, hey, this is my buddy, this happened to a friend of mine, I would have been like, who should I write a check to? I would have never got involved. But it happened to a really close friend of mine. So it's got to be authentic. But I think you will see more of it because I think we broke the mold a little bit in no one had done this in ownership before, and it didn't backfire.
Right. Right.
So,
it didn't bankrupt you.
Yeah. Not yet, at least.
Well, I think, Clint, this is an interesting question just about how the media work, because we are very interested in individual stories. We do tend to focus on personalities. One person has done something. Meek Mill is a big name. Maya Moore is a big name. Are we losing something about like the everyday realities that just grind away for most people in prison by focusing on kind of celebrity?
I don't think there's a human in America who understands the everyday reality of anybody in prison if they haven't been in prison. So there's that. But I do think there is a lot of merit to what you're saying, because cause célèbres, for lack of a better term, are really that for that reason. And at least what I try to do is point out the things that are just a little less obvious to readers and listeners and viewers, because I do believe that the root of what you're saying is correct. With the standard operating procedure for so many different things, from the prison system to the bail system to everything, is just something that people don't interact with. And for as much as people connecting to Maya's attempts to get her friend out of jail are instructive for them, to me it is how her efforts or Meek's efforts or anybody's efforts force people to think more about what's happening around them. That to me is really what the goal is here. And I think back to the All-Star game, the baseball All-Star game in Cleveland. And for people who don't know, like Cleveland got rid of a racist logo from their team, and it was a big to-do on some level, but then it kind of wasn't. And they had the All-Star game there, and I was really expecting to see a lot of, for lack of a better term, wackos dressed up in red-face trying to defend something that, but they didn't. It was actually very cool. People were chill about that, and it kind of surprised me. Like I wrote a column about it because, in some of these spaces, the mindset of I get to keep what's mine is very important. But I think if you think about, how the media has affected things, how athletes have said things, you can just you can make people's minds better. You can teach people to be better humans on the globe. And that to me is what this is about. It's the unfairness of the system is something that people dedicate their lives to that, frankly, is deeper depth than I'm willing to bring up on this panel. But I do think there's something to be said for, people watch TV every day. If you convince them that the right thing is the right thing, then it just might work. And sometimes it does.
I think it's the everyday story, which is going to, for us, I can tell you what we're going to do with the Reform Alliance is we're going to have big celebrities and athletes and influencers tell the everyday stories, and that's how we're going to win on a state-by-state basis. So I know right now we hired a chief lawyer at the Reform Alliance, and her goal is to find the most screwed up cases in each state that we're fighting. So in Pennsylvania, we said, okay, let's go in and let's find the Meek Mill screwed up case that's not from Meek Mill. Because, by the way, Meek Mill was 1 in 7 billion. Like, to have someone who happened to be one of my closest friends, who's a really famous rapper, who lived in Philadelphia in a state that had no cap on probation, who'd been sent to prison 4 times for never committing a crime, that ain't never happening again, okay? Or at least that better not happen again. Maybe it will happen again, actually. But we're gonna do everything to make sure it doesn't happen. But for us, what we're doing is we're trying to find the person that you've never heard of, and we're gonna find crazy cases, and then we're gonna tell that in a story and have people tell that on social media. So when Meek or Jay-Z or LeBron James or Joel Embiid or Ben Simmons or whoever, James Harden, is telling the story on their social media. I saw something just yesterday. I don't know how many people saw this, but it really bothered me. So a buddy of mine played for the Eagles and then just went to the Panthers, Torrey Smith, and he recently retired. And yesterday he put something on his social media about a little 10-year-old kid who got beat up by like 3 or 4 people, and it was basically about how wrong bullying is. And I saw it, and I sent it to my daughter right away. I said, anytime you, and my daughter's 13 and a half with a big personality, shockingly, and I sent her a message. I said, anytime you see this, you better jump in and stop it. And so there's Torrey Smith educating me about bullying, which isn't something that I've really thought that much about, but I got it because, the story was just a 10-year-old kid. He saw this, and it was a parent crying out saying, help me, my kid's not safe. And then Torrey saw it, and he put it out there. Now it's been going everywhere on social media. So I think athletes, celebrities have this incredible platform to tell the everyday story, and there are so many bad everyday stories, and that's I think what we're compelled to do. And that's what we're going to do strategically on a state-by-state basis, when we're fighting, to change laws.
Because the celebrities can bring the attention to the everyday
For
stories.
sure.
Right, exactly. Maya, I know you have just spent some time with the Congressional Black Caucus and kind of talking about criminal justice reform here on the Hill with policymakers. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and what's your sense about where is this issue going in our nation's capital right now?
Well, if you had asked me that a year ago, I'd have looked at you like this. So I'm very excited that I'm learning more, and I feel more educated, and I've been able to connect with people and organizations that have helped me, the people like you say that are doing the daily work, the grind, who've been in it for decades. Before I get to my time at the caucus, I recently got to meet Brian Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative team, and I'm just blown away. If any of you in this room have not been to the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama,
go right now.
I'm gonna give you 5 minutes, book your ticket, and we'll keep this panel going. But that changed my life. The Equal Justice Initiative recently erected a legacy museum literally right where slaves used to be trafficked. It's just so powerful, the proximity principle that they have of making the education and awareness in the middle of where it happened and is happening. Just really helped me learn and put into context where we come from, why things are why they are, and with that education, now we can proceed better with policy and how we view things and how we craft our communities. And so one of the big things walking away from my time with EJI before I came to the caucus panel, and Jonathan actually was the first person to educate me about this, but is the conviction integrity units is something that I learned about, which is basically a checks and balances opportunity in the prosecutor's office. Conviction integrity units are established to prevent and look into the integrity of convictions. And so this is a huge opportunity for change and accountability. Back when I was wearing that shirt with my fellow captains on the links, justice and accountability, we knew these were good things, but at that point in my career, I didn't know how we needed to make justice, justice and accountability happen. And so conviction integrity units is something that I've learned we can advocate for. We can, as athletes, use our relatability in the sports world to say, hey, police, we love you, we need you, we appreciate you. There's been a lot of bad press for you, but there's also police that are passionate and have integrity and want to do well, and prosecutors' offices that want to do well. Here's how we can help you and do that better by having these conviction integrity units, just like on a basketball team. You know, if I don't have someone who's holding me accountable, I'm not going to be as good as I need to be. And so just changing the narrative as athletes is something that I think we talked about on the panel, to not make this progress seem like it's hate against the powers that be right now. And so that's something when it comes to athletes being responsible, they can help give that good information and really come in with the education to be able to, when they have those opportunities, to impact policymakers and communities, that we can give some helpful information with the platform that we have. And so I was excited to be able to kind of vision cast and just remind people in that space from the caucus of the importance of helping everyone be able to vote, everyone to be a little bit more engaged civically, and to understand some of these key things that need to be put into place and emphasized if we want to actually do something that we already know is screwed up. But there's so many resources. But you know, EJI is a really, really trustworthy source, nonprofit that have encouraged me and influenced me and educated me towards, whenever I have that opportunity to be in front of policymakers, I can give some really helpful information to a world that's already swarming with so much information, but to be really specific about what real change looks like.
If you don't mind, it's not a diversion, it's just directly related to the two things that both of them have been talking about, and it's been on my mind since we've got here, which is a story that happened after the NBA Finals ended. And for those of you who don't know, Masai Ujiri is the president of operations for the Raptors. He's a Nigerian brother. He's pretty tall. He looks like a basketball player. He was a basketball player. And he got into a row, that's the word we'll use, with a security guard at, Oakland, Alameda, whatever, wherever the Warriors play.
Old Warrior Stadium.
Old Warrior Stadium, not in San Francisco. And there's a moment where the security guard is claiming this guy, whatever the confrontation is, there's a very plain moment between black man Masai Ujiri and this older white dude, and the look on the two guys' faces is like a look everybody understands. It didn't matter who was whom in that situation. And the reason I thought about this is in terms of what athletes do in terms of so many other things. And what happens is there's a guy who's with Masai who gets in the middle, and Masai is just looking at him, and then just out of nowhere, Kyle Lowry comes up, just pulls him onto the court. And the very famous line, "We over here." And it was one of those real life but real athlete things that happened where when I saw it, I mean, it was emotional because you could tell how Masai felt. All of a sudden, none of this other crap mattered, and Kyle obviously recognized that, and he was just like, "Nah, dog, that not here, not today, not now, not this moment. They're not going to take it from us." And every once in a while, you do get a moment like that, and I'm not saying I don't know that Kyle doesn't do that in a different situation. I don't know him that well, but I know that was one of the big times in my life where I thought, wow, that was really, you want to know what it's really like to be taken out of your space, but in front of everybody, but somebody really can help you in an athlete in that kind of way, because he was literally wearing a jersey and nobody could do anything about it. That was one, and that just came to mind when we think about basketball and we think about athletes helping. So I just wanted to share
and it's so
that.
visual as you describe it.
The footage is crazy if you see it. So I mean, check it out on your own, obviously. But it was quite an interesting moment.
Yeah. I want to open up the floor to the audience for questions, but before I do, I just wanted to ask one last question, since we started down the road talking about politics in Washington and so forth. I think it's no secret that this White House has a kind of unique ability to divide people. A lot of athletes are divided about whether or not to interact with the White House. I think a lot of criminal justice advocates are divided about whether or not the First Step Act was a good thing and whether President Trump has been helpful in some way on criminal justice reform. Sports is, supposed to transcend politics, right? You got fans on both sides of the aisle. Do you feel that criminal justice reform is something that you can bring to all the communities that care about your teams and your sports? Can we transcend politics? Tiny little question.
Simply put, yes. One of the things that I think separates criminal justice is so glaring about criminal justice is it's such a clearly a human issue. And what kind of human beings do we want to be? It really exposes the state of the health of our community. The fact that we lead the world in people in prison, like that should hurt us at our core. Like every single one of us should take that and be ashamed of that, because that means our communities are failing. And then we need to figure out why are our communities failing, and then we need to own that and acknowledge why our communities are failing and where it comes from and the history of it and why certain communities have been impacted more than others. And we need to own it. We need to acknowledge it. That's the education, part of the education process. But every step throughout this journey, if you don't attach these changes with like humanity, it's just going to get political. And the more athletes, I think, can be, like that might be the most powerful thing we could do. We could recommend policy or changes or strategy, which is all important. But athletes, I think, have an uncanny ability to humanize a situation, because it's just so universal. And the sports experience is so universal. There's something so human about playing on a team and connecting with, just bodies in motion and just coming around a common cause. And it's just, you're very human in some of those play arenas. And so just having a powerful athlete tell a human's story, like that's just, you can't make that up. It's just so real. So I think that's one of the ways that it can transcend, the part of politics that we don't, that dehumanizes us. But to remind ourselves as we're debating or figuring out what's next is, am I helping this person become more human or less human? And in the process, am I becoming more human or less human in every step that I engage, and how I react and how I listen and how I put myself out there to engage in these conversations. So it's not easy, what I just said, but it's possible. And it's, I think, the only way forward when it comes to criminal justice reform, because it's just crazy when the more you dive in and you see these stories, you're like, these are real people, and that's what moves you. These aren't, they're real people's lives at the very basic core, like people and how we deal with crime and how we deal with punishment and restoration and rehabilitation and justice. Like these are, it's going to define us. And we can't just pretend like this isn't going to matter. Like this is literally one of the most important issues of our day and how it's going to define our generation.
Thank you. That's beautifully put, actually. Yeah. Did you want to add something, Mike?
I mean, I really believe timing in life is everything, and I think criminal justice reform, the timing's now. I think there's never been, people are actually, this is the one issue people don't disagree on. And I'm, like, I'll tell you, like, look, I'm certainly not a, I'm not a political person at all. I was just joking on the way up here. I didn't even know who the governor of my state was before everything with Meek happened, and before I bought a company that he was helpful in us buying. But like for me, my perspective is we'll work with anybody to get something done. So I don't care. I don't care, Republican, Democrat, Trump, not Trump, white, purple, blue. To me, just if we can get our agenda moved forward of criminal justice reform, work with anyone to accomplish that. And I think we are perfectly, like, the timing is right now. There's never probably the best thing about the First Step Act, to be honest, has been how much awareness is brought to Republicans in criminal justice reform, because this is really, I think, traditionally a Democratic issue. And I think you've got, Republicans saying, wow, this is okay, I'm going to support this. So, I know in Pennsylvania right now, we've got Republicans and Democrats arm in arm to change the laws. And that's something that's really incredible. And we've got as many Republicans caring about this issue as many Democrats. But I think the timing's great. It's right now.
I think where criminal justice reform is going to be most effective is in convincing people that the willfully ignorant premise of sports is not supposed to be political is wrong. I mean, you know what I'm saying? Like, I think that's where you have to start. I mean, if you're black in America, if you are a human in any part of the world where just where you play and what you're allowed to play is directly correlated to the human politics around you, like, there's only one group of people that has the privilege of saying the sports isn't supposed to be political. And those are the people that control the sports. And if you think about it that way, it changes what the purpose is of why so many people play and why so many people even enjoy it. And of all the things I've seen, issues that come into the sports world, I don't think I've ever seen any of them that were as effective at making people believe that this was all bigger than just the ball than criminal justice reform. It certainly hasn't been protecting women. It certainly hasn't been, fairness in pay or anything like that. I mean, it's been, we're putting people in cages, like, just for kind of nothing. Like that, I mean, that affects people's minds. People understand that is wrong, and they can get to, well, maybe the rest of this is probably not the way we should be doing it too, from there a lot more easily than they can a lot of other topics. And that's where I think this one connects to the sports world most directly.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, sir.
This question is for Maya Moore. You were in the middle of your WNBA career, going extremely well, and you made this decision to step away from the game. Can you just go into that decision-making process? What made you determined to learn more about this issue, so much so that you stopped playing basketball professionally?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if this is the time and place for me to go into all of the process of my decision to step away, but I will say that one of the things that has weighed on my heart as I've engaged more and more in Jonathan's personal fight is I wanted to be there for his story and to see this through. I'm a very committed person. Athletes are very loyal people, as far as like their family, and like we're gonna fight to win. And like when we enter into something, no, we're not leaving this court. I don't care if the street lights are coming on. Like, we're gonna finish this game. So we're kind of stubborn in that sense of like, I wanted to be there and show up and be able to come here today. Otherwise, hopefully my team would have been in the playoffs. I wouldn't be here in front of you guys right now. And so there is a cost, as I mentioned in my Players Tribune piece, of what we do. And what we do is very costly, and it takes a lot. And so I wouldn't say that was the tipping point of why I stepped away, but it was definitely one of the things that excited me about my time away. And but it's also, I could have been doing so many other things with my time away. Something more comfortable, something less emotional, something less mentally taxing. But because my motivation is connected to a human being and other human beings, I have the motivation to stay engaged and to use my gifts to help be a voice for those who don't have a voice. And so I was excited that I wouldn't have to compete between the team that I'm committed to and this real life, bigger than basketball person and cause that I'm committed to. That was one of the benefits and things that I have I'm grateful and have a lot of peace about, that I have the space to be able to show up for things. But, athletes who are in season and doing things, I just want to just emphasize, it's extremely hard to be engaged in some of these issues and being at the top of your craft. Like, it's so hard, and I don't want any of us to underappreciate the athletes that do engage, because it's not normal. Like, it's just to show up every day to do what we do and to focus in the pressure and to perform and the travel, and we have family issues. Like, it's to step out of yourself to engage in these issues. Like, let's champion those athletes. Let's listen to them. Let's get behind them, because it's hard to do. I couldn't imagine what this year would have looked like for me if I was fully invested in my team and trying to bring Jonathan home and raise awareness for some of these causes. It's just, you can only do so much. And so I just have a lot of respect for the athletes that take that time and the resources they have, especially female athletes. Like, we don't have as much resources. And so a lot of the things that we do come from people who are willing to invest, not because they're getting paid to do it. So I'm definitely so grateful for all that I've been able to do in this year away, and even before, but especially this year.
Yes, ma'am.
Good afternoon. My name is Beauty Bibbart, and I'm actually one of those individuals out in Loudoun, Virginia, who's running for the prosecutor's office because of what you said, Ms. Moore. You realize that the power is in the prosecutors, not in the judges. My question to the three of you is this. Is there an effort to synergize all of your efforts? Because individually you are hitting all of the important issues that are within the criminal justice system that are failing our people. But is there an effort to synergize that so that we're actually dealing with it globally and then also trying to promote people so that they are actually getting out and becoming invested in voting on these elections?
Yeah, maybe I'll take a crack at that. I mean, I think there are a lot of really good people working in criminal justice reform. For me, when I accidentally ended up, here, the first thing I did was, when I figured out that I wanted to help make a real difference, was to try to understand all the different things that were going on. You see that there are people doing great work in bail, and there are people doing great work on changing the prosecutors. I think, first, what I've learned in business, and I've screwed up a lot of things in business, is focus is everything. And so when we started the Reform Alliance, we talked about should we do, there are hundreds of thousands of people that get out of prison every year. Should we work on reentry work, which seemed really interesting to me. And I know so many people in corporate America, and I can help, hundreds of thousands of people get jobs. But then we said, look, you know what? The single biggest problem is probation and parole, which it's 2/3 of the system. And that's what plagued Meek's entire adult life. And that's what and no one else was really focused on. That's what we said, we're going to put all of our energy into that. So I think it's actually good to have people that focus on a specific issue and do a great job with it, because the issue is so freaking complicated.
It's broad.
It's like, when I tell you we're going to, over the next several years, we're trying to get 1 million people out of the system just from probation and parole reform, that's going to take a Herculean effort. What I think there is, though, there's huge respect and admiration amongst the different people in criminal justice reform. So we work with so many different organizations, and we'll align, like, we're going to do a bill in Pennsylvania, and there's other things that we can help to get in that bill that don't complicate our issue. We'll do that. So I think there is a lot of, like, we want to align with everybody, but we still want to be 100% focused on probation and parole reform. And I'm concerned if we get it all distracted, we'll screw up getting the 1 million people plus out that I've, kind of committed to by 2023. So I think I will just, I'd say a thank you to, everyone who's working on criminal justice reform, because I'm blown away by how many people have committed their lives. This is, I've committed a portion of my life and, a portion of money. I've seen people like, you talked about Brian Stevenson, who's just, this guy is like, he's committed his entire life to this. I've seen so many people, Van Jones and Jessica, they've committed their lives to this. So I think there are so many good people in this fight, and I think people are aligning pretty well overall, but I think focus is also really important.
I was going to say, too, what I've learned and what Michael was just talking about is it's a broad issue. When I first started to learn, I'm like, this is crazy. There's so many things wrong. But then I was advised, pick a lane and run hard in that lane, and then other people will have their lane, and they run hard in their lane, and everybody gets in their lane, and together we can move forward while still having communication, like you said, between those lanes to make sure we're working together. But I think it's so critical to this thing is so big, and it's been happening for so long, that you have to stay encouraged and hopeful. You have to stay in a lane and then rely on the other people doing work in their lanes in order for it to happen. It's just like a team. I can't be point guard, shooting guard. I mean, at times I can, but
You might be able to.
You know.
Flex.
but I gotta stay, in my lane and do my job. And if somebody can help somebody here and there, set a screen for the other person's lane, I can set a screen so they can get a shot. But that's just a great reminder. Like, focus and staying in your lane actually gives you a chance to get this done. But one of the things I feel like as athletes we can do to cover the whole thing and help is voting. Because until everybody has the power and to safely vote, that's just one of the ways to be heard and have a voice. And everybody at the basic human level deserves to have their voice heard in this country. That's how our country is set up. And that's we don't have to argue about that. Like, giving everybody the chance to vote is fundamental and basic and is a way to help things be better. As we're educating, we need to be able to do something now with that education. And so I think it's just a really easy entry point for athletes to help raise education and provide opportunities to help in areas around the country where people can't vote. And registration, the panel, Clinton, we were just at
Friday.
One of the panelists mentioned the fact that if we don't have people able to vote, then we can't vote for prosecutors, and then prosecutorial reform is hindered, but also jury duty.
Right.
And showing up for jury duty, and the fact that you can't show up for jury duty if you aren't registered. You know, like, it's just these little things that you don't
Peers.
realize, like, juries matter a lot too. And so voting is fundamental to, and being registered to vote is one of those things that seems so small that can make a huge difference in engaging in some of these changes for everybody. So stay in your lane, but everybody can help everybody vote, I think is a good way to sum it up. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just having seen so many of these things, there's way too much energy spent on the theoretical concept of unity versus simply knowing right from wrong and empowering yourself to do right. Just personal opinion.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Kimberly Harris from Real Talk Sports here in Washington, D.C. I want to know from any of the three on the panel here, what can local media, and especially the national sports media that are sitting at the ESPNs, the sports centers, what can they do to get behind these stories, tell these powerful stories to a younger audience that's coming along, looking at these guys, these sports athletes, as God, literally God, and seeing their demise within the realms of being unjustified criminal unjustification towards them. What can we do in the media perspective to get that out there and help and make better stories that people can engage and relate to?
I'll take that. It's tough to answer because in many ways this is what I consider what it is I do. And I'll tell you how I do that, which is it's easy to go to a shoot around and talk to Giannis. It's easy to, I don't know, show up to a football game and ask RG3 if he's, whatever wants to do. It's not easy to hang out at a baseball field at June on North Carolina, you know what I'm saying, with a person who nobody otherwise knows. I mean, it's the time spent. That's really all it is. The time spent for me was a lot of things that were not the highest levels of the world, and you just don't forget who those people are. I mean, that's just the easiest way to put it. The importance of local media to me is impossible to overstate for a lot of reasons, not just because I happen to work in my hometown, which is here, but because, yeah, there are things that otherwise you just don't know because you're not going to know. But don't forget, I mean, everybody who you see on your television came from a smaller place before. So, I think it's a matter of people being themselves and making sure that they don't forget who they are, because that's how you still remember the things that are less sort of visible to, I think, the national scale, but are still important to you, and that's the only real way to do it is you've got to want it and you've got to believe it. And if you don't, well, sure, but reminder, wanting and believing it doesn't make you good necessarily doing your job, which is why the people you see on some screens don't care as much as the people you see on others.
Yes, ma'am, back here.
Hi, thank you guys very much. One follow-up question for Mr. Rubin on the Reform Alliance. You were just talking, Maya was just mentioning as well about voting and voting rights, et cetera. As part of your education and also advocacy policy process, are you working with those same kind of parolees to be able to know if they're able to vote in each of these different states, since there are folks that have been arrested for even trying to go vote, and are you going to be telling those ridiculous stories, as you put it before, through the voices of athletes as well?
Yeah, few things. First, I think there are so many ridiculous stories that you can't, like, I mean, I see, you know, I can't even look at my own social media, which is teeny, without seeing ridiculous stories where you can't believe this stuff's actually happening. To me, I believe this is the criminal justice reform, the criminal justice system, it's probably one of the more misunderstood big issues in our country. So I think education is so important. So if I look at, like, I said we have two things to do: change laws and to educate people. Marketing is like, it's one of the two most important things we need to do, because again, it's changing laws and it's marketing. So when you talk about media, I look at social media, I look at people in the media, I look at athletes, celebrities, everyone together needs to, like, just message it out there to educate to be honest, if there's 350 million people in this country, I think a quarter of the people or a third of the people might understand the issue, and 2/3 or 3/4 might not understand the issue. And the people that understand the issue are, quite frankly, the people that grew up not as well off. You know, they grew up in the environment where they've had firsthand knowledge of this. So for us, storytelling is everything. The primary messages that we'll talk about will be probation, horrendous probation situations in the places we want to change laws. But what also happens is you call me and you say, hey, you know, this is really bothering me. Can you get your guys to put it on social media? And it's got nothing to do with what we're doing, but the story affects us, so we go out and talk to. And that's the kind of network. Like, I see Meek talks about so many things that have nothing to do with probation day in and day out. He has a friend of his who he met in prison the last go-around who was absolutely wrongly accused of murder. And, you know, Meek won't stop talking about the story until this person gets out of prison, because he cares so deeply about it. And you pick up different stories along the way that have nothing to do with probation. So I'd say, in general, our founders, and we have, you know, an incredible founding group of partners, they care deeply about criminal justice reform. And while we're 100% focused on probation and parole, if we see a bad story that bothers us, people will tell it personally, and we have huge platforms to do it with. And then the network of people tell it as well. And you see, we have, like, this great sports and entertainment network that will get behind, you know, stories that we really think are just wrong, even if they're not probation and parole related.
Hi, this question is for the panel. Since criminal justice in sports is, where the intersection of criminal justice and sports is something that obviously you all care deeply about, how do you feel about the backlash that one Jay-Z has received over partnering with the NFL and entering into this conversation, trying to progress criminal justice in sports? And what do you think that we can all do to get on the same page so that, you know, this conversation can progress and not be, I don't know, kind of staggered by just one individual?
You know, again, I think the value of being on the same page is not necessarily as high as people think. I mean, that is the conversation. Mugs aren't on the same page. That's the reason why you're having the conversation. I mean, the backlash regarding Jay-Z, I mean, I think is just people perhaps wanting somebody to do something that they probably weren't ever really going to do. And we get back to that whole superhero status thing, which is, you know, when you're representing a certain amount of people, or at least you're claiming to, or the people believe you do, it is very difficult to, in fact, do that in execution. And, you know, the NFL is a powerful league. It's probably the most powerful league in, maybe not the history of this country, but at this moment, it certainly is. But, again, I want to make that clear. The concept of getting on the same page, in my personal opinion, as somebody who, you know, works in media, every other competitor makes you better. And I don't mean that you have to be competing against each other for the goal, but, like, you know, we all know what's right, we all know what's wrong. Just do the right, I mean, just, you know what I mean? Just do the right thing. I don't care if I'm not on the same page with you, because it might not both be the same right thing, but if we're all working towards the same goal, maybe we'll win.
So let me just, I mean, I couldn't be closer to the situation, just based on having Robert Kraft, the most successful most successful sports owner in modern history, and Jay on each side of me in the Reform Alliance. Let me tell you something I've learned about Jay, because I didn't know Jay other than a teeny bit socially before Meek went to prison 2 years ago. This is a guy who does not care about money. He cares about doing right. And I can tell you, and I've said this, so I was originally didn't really want to talk about it, but I've said this a few times in the last couple of months. When Meek went to prison, you know, he was he wasn't near at the level he was today. No one thought him going to prison would have any change. There was, to me, it was just my boy. And for Jay, they were committed. We thought it was going to take a couple $100,000 and a few weeks to get him out of prison. And between Jay and I, we spent $7 million and 6 months of basically focused mostly on this because we were so outraged by what we saw. So that's when I first saw Jay's character. This is a guy who, we kept looking at each other like, hey, this is starting to become, even to really successful people, this is becoming real money. No one's paying for this but Jay and myself. And no one cared because it was so offensive what was happening. Jay would have spent his fortune, I would have spent my fortune because we didn't care because it was so wrong. That's number one. Number two, I can tell you, the reason that Jay got involved with the NFL was he felt that, as you just said, this is the sport with the biggest platform. It's the biggest sport in America today. It's got the biggest reach. And he felt from the inside he could make a real difference. And I can tell you something about Jay. He does not give a shit about money. He cares about right and wrong. And I've been on the recipient side of several phone calls where you'll get a phone call from Rock Nation, from his partner Desiree Perez, on Jay's behalf, or from Jay to say, we need to fix this because it's that important. And even the interactions around the NFL in the last, month of how much he cares about using that platform to help bring people together and fix issues, that is the only reason he did it. So I look at it and I actually think anyone who's questioning Jay-Z, they don't know what he's about. I mean, this is a guy of the highest integrity. I learn from him every day. And I'm probably a little bit overly defensive now because I'm watching people beat him up about his involvement in the NFL. I'm saying, man, you guys don't get it. This is a guy, the money is meaningless, meaningless to him. He's, he spent more than that on legal things that help people that he has nothing to do with. It's purely about, can he help to make the country better, and can he bring people together by using the NFL's platform? I can tell you, if he can, he's all in, and if he can't, he won't want to be a part of it.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Jami Elianti. I'm a former St. Louis athlete, newly admitted DC attorney, and a recent Howard Law grad. So I'm excited to continue.
You're the perfect person to be here.
I'm excited to be a part of this conversation and continue to contribute to social justice and criminal justice across the country. To my question, I understand that there's a process, there's an order of operations, and you have actionable items, and everyone has a role. I'm curious as to whether any of you have explored any, preventative initiatives in the communities to kind of literally disrupt the school to prison pipeline. What can we do to be more involved in the communities and kind of stop from having to get to the parole stage? I'm really passionate about this issue, so I'm excited to find out what I can do more and what you all are doing and what I can do to be a part of that. Join
your school board. School boards have a lot of control in a lot of communities over a lot of things that people don't realize. Join your school board.
Absolutely.
I covered a lot of local politics. You'd be surprised how much power people in school boards wield in terms of what happens in schools at a larger level than just one.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you. I actually have a lot of colleagues that are primary level educators, and they've spoken to some of the issues in the school boards that I feel like it would be important that maybe you all could get involved in. A lot of the times, children that look like me are being transported to alternative schools for learning disabilities that aren't diagnosed fully. I think there are a lot of avenues to explore here. And I know there's a lot to unpack.
You got my
I just
vote.
wanted to start the conversation.
He's voting for you.
The mayor of Philadelphia called me recently, and he said, hey, I got a question for you. He said, we have a list of the 50 most dangerous people in Philadelphia that we think are going to kill each other shortly. He said, can you get Meek to come talk to them and tell them there's a better way? I called Meek, and I said, Meek, and I had no idea how he was going to react, because this is again, the 50 most dangerous people in Philadelphia. And I called Meek, and I said, Meek, will you do this? He said, Michael, anytime. I love it. I can talk, I came from their world. I can talk people out of this. So it's something that I think you'll see. By the way, this is very recent. So, I got the phone call. Meek was like, I'm in, let's go do this. So I think there is a lot. I look at what our guys do at the Sixers. I look at what Meek does. I look at what my friends do who have much bigger platforms than my company has or I'd ever have. And I think they're doing a lot. I know that Meek's going to schools to school every week, talking to kids, explaining them, because again, I didn't come from that world, so I can talk about entrepreneurialism and how to kind of will something to happen. But Meek, no one can tell it better than Meek about how to get out of the environment he grew up in. And I think one by one, you just got to make a difference. And I think I know a lot of people around me care deeply about this issue and are making real differences.
Yeah, but also just vision casting, storytelling, what you just said, like helping people around you, local media, the school board. Like, I didn't know that. I don't have children yet, but there are people that can get more engaged if they just know what to do. And so the education, again, education of there are ways about doing this, but storytelling, whether it's locally or from us as, with a bigger platform of how to help in that lane of schools to prisons. So it's great.
I think we have a last question here, the gentleman at the side.
Thank you. Thank you for this conversation. I'd like to affirm something that Maya said earlier on in the discussion around the enormous power that prosecutors have in the system as gatekeepers. Yep. They're the ones who decide which charges to bring, and oftentimes we find in jurisdictions that they will overcharge. Yep. Full disclosure, I work at a public defender organization. I'm from New York, and I'd like to bring public defenders into the conversation, because oftentimes when we speak about reform and disruption of the system, and also bringing and allowing for the people who are directly impacted to have their narrative stand out as examples for yourselves and for the rest of the country to understand the impact of the system in people's lives, we often overlook the role that public defenders play. Public defenders represent the vast majority of people in this country who are charged with criminal offenses.
Do you have a question, sir? I'm sorry.
Yes.
You're the last question.
Yes, I'm sorry. And I just wanted to know, in relationship, Maya, to your advice for folks to vote rightly for prosecutors that reflect their values, what role do you see in this reform movement for public defenders, recognizing that in some locales there are no public defender offices? They're literally private attorneys who are tasked with representing with various levels of expertise and experience.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Unfortunately, I don't feel as competent in that area of solutions other than understanding it's a problem. I've learned, I got to speak with some prosecutors out in LA during my educational journey a couple years ago, and some had been prosecutors, some had public defenders, and just how under-supported public defenders are, and that's broken as well. But the one thing I've learned from my friends at EJI now is one of the solutions that they found in different jurisdictions that are doing reform well is interdepartmental communication. And so more of a culture of everybody involved in justice needs to have a say and to help. And the culture has to shift of it's me versus you and the common goal. Like, we don't have to necessarily agree on everything, but our common goal needs to be justice. And right now our common goal isn't justice in our justice system. And so just that culture change of, everybody that has a role needs to be heard and empowered to bring what they can so that justice can be done. And so one of those is, public defenders definitely need to be championed more and figure out how to empower that representation. But the need for the great need that we have for people to be defended should hopefully decrease, and then that burden that public defenders have won't be there if we continue to make reforms and changes. And so it'll all get solved as different areas start to get fixed and reformed. But I'm not an expert in that particular category of the public defender's office, but I've been learning that it does need to be a part of the conversation. So I acknowledge the need, but I just don't feel educated enough to be able to provide exact solutions, but it's all connected. When one thing gets better, the others will be impacted too.
One of my favorite stories at the Marshall Project is one that we wrote about Idaho. Idaho is a very red state, and they have done a better job funding public defenders than many other states. And the reason has to do with their own narrative, which is that the government is big and bad and tyrannical, and it's out to get you. And you, as the little guy, need to be defended against that. So, you know, we all, I think, come to this issue with different narratives. This is the end of a year-long effort by the Marshall Project to bring people together who are narrative tellers and can disrupt and change narratives. And I think today we've heard from a wonderful group of people who are working on narrative from their own perspective. I know some of you have been at this series throughout the whole year. I see a few familiar faces, so thank you for being with us. And thank you to all the panelists for a really fascinating presentation today.